What's going on, y'all? It's Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B, and we are back for another episode of the FSG Podcast. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, if this is your first time joining, thanks for hopping in as we continue to dive into some of the most important trends and strategies for our various industries that we serve. But more importantly, if you are looking to tap into more content from the FSG team, I want to make sure you're heading to our website, fsg.com. For more, again, that's fsg.com. Make sure you're subscribing to the podcast as well on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. All right, let's dive right in. We've got another inner strategy style conversation here from the FSG team, pulling from our own experience, working in different contractor environments, commercial environments, right, to offer y'all, our audience, some strategies, some tips and advice on how to maneuver evolutions in our industry. So today, we're going to hone in on energy efficiency. It's a big one, right? You're probably familiar with the buzzword. It gets tossed around a lot in our boardrooms, our budget meetings, right? We want to have our buildings be energy efficient. But for commercial buildings, this isn't just, some kind of mantra. Obviously, this is a business imperative. So between rising energy costs, aging infrastructure, and mounting pressure to meet various regional sustainability goals, company-wide sustainability goals, right? Wherever those are coming from, facility leaders are having to ask themselves the hard questions. Where is energy actually being wasted? What fixes are actually going to move the needle? And how do you turn efficiency into a strategic advantage for your facility operations? So on this episode of the FSG Podcast, we're going to break down what energy efficiency really looks like in practice, right? From quick wins to future-proofing your entire operation, making sense of some of the areas, right? The buckets where there is a lot of waste usually, maybe some misconceptions around assessing that waste, and how to implement energy-efficient solutions that are in line with immediate facility goals as well as larger business goals. So joining me today is David Burrow. He's Director of Business Development at FSG, and he's worked with many a business in his time at FSG to help them translate building data into actionable upgrades and measurable savings, whether it's lighting or HVAC, automation, to even just audits, right? David is bringing a pragmatic lens to cutting energy waste, boosting performance, and helping be a partner for facility pros to bring energy efficiency to their building in a practical and sustainable, pun intended, way. So let's go ahead and dive in. David Burrow, welcome to the podcast, man. How you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you again for joining us. So let's dive right in, David. I want to get your thoughts here on the trend of energy efficiency, right? Over the last, let's say, 20 years, even, this has become, one of the competitive battlefields for businesses, right? To prove they are energy efficient. It often helps secure, more funding, helps make them, obviously more efficient, better manage their resources, their funds. But for the facility manager, this is an incredibly practical goal and ties into assessing all the moving pieces of their operation to identify waste and then right-size that waste. Would you say that energy efficiency is considered a growing priority for commercial buildings today? Is it already a top priority? Kind of how is energy efficiency being assessed and weighed against other challenges and priorities today in the commercial building industry and market? What are your thoughts? What are you seeing?
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, I think it's a great question with a lot of different avenues that we can kind of break it down into. But if we were just to look at it from a initial lens, the way I always identify it is it's certainly top of mind, top of conversation with a lot of people. Kind of going back to a term you used early on, I think a lot of times it gets muddled by buzzwords, top hitting topics that might be commonplace as of right now. The term of ESG is, pretty flagrantly thrown around without much definition oftentimes. And so what we strive to do, and oftentimes when I'm getting involved with clients, is we take kind of this very organic, not well-defined concept and try to add real actionable definition to it. If we were to look into that a little bit deeper, oftentimes the easy button is to say LED lighting. Well, if you start looking at LED lighting, in a lot of instances, we've already seen a pretty significant conversion. There's still a wealth of opportunity out there for that. But what so often happens is somebody just simply looks at LED lighting and they're not actually looking at the overall opportunity as a whole and what's really going to drive that optimization of the capital expenditure, give them the best ROI, and also at the same time intrinsically improve the site conditions as a whole. Oftentimes what we're looking at is a far more holistic approach, something that's going to look at everything exterior to interior and then come up with a prioritization of how to implement those solutions, how they align to the various company goals and strategies that each client has. They're all very unique. So again, looking at something as simple as LED lighting, a very commonly overlooked item that complements it extremely well is lighting controls. I see it far, far too often, especially in the world that we tend to live in, which is unpermitted renovation work. Very often that's something that's not being implemented just because it's not being required by permitting and code. But the reality is it's a tremendous amount of money left on the table by clients to omit that. And it also intrinsically drives a immense amount of value to the tenants and the people within the space, just because the functionality of the space becomes so much more usable. So in a nutshell, that's kind of how I look at it.
Let's hone in on older facilities, for example. Aging infrastructure is a challenge across the United States right now. We actually should be getting an American Society of Civil Engineers report card for our infrastructure this year, I think. I always refer to the 2021 report card. But anyways, to put it mildly, our infrastructure at large is not doing great. And there's a lot of work that we need to do to up said infrastructure, including a lot of our commercial facilities, older ones that have been in operation for years, decades at this point, that need a boost. And we often see it's in those older facilities where there is considerable energy waste. And so now facility managers have to balance, which avenue do they start with, right? If they have to renovate more or less every aspect of the building, where do you start? What is going to help achieve some short-term wins that can maybe build momentum around funding and reinforcing other renovations? All that being said, what do you see as some of the most common sources of energy waste in these older facilities, right? The ones that are kind of a go-to, they always stand out, and they're having an outsized impact on generating waste and being a financial burden on these facility operations.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, when we talk about existing aging buildings as a whole, the overarching challenge that so many of these facilities and companies are being challenged with is, very simply being asked to do more with less. And so that's really the challenge and the optic or lens, if you will, that we come into with every project. And so specifically to your question, what we try to drive is identifying what I like to characterize as low-cost, high-yield solutions. And what I mean by that is I'm never going to go into a site and say, you need to replace every rooftop unit for your HVAC system. Could that be a great solution? Absolutely. Could it net savings? Absolutely. But is it the most pragmatic approach for getting a tremendous ROI and the best bang for the buck? Absolutely not. And so with that, what we're typically doing is looking at what are the biggest portions or the biggest energy hogs within the site. Oftentimes that's going to be in the world of HVAC. Typically speaking, HVAC is accounting for approximately 40% or more of the utility spend. Second to that is lighting. Lighting is typically accounting for anywhere between 20 to 25%. So that's typically where we're zeroing in first and foremost. Then after that, it's identifying and understanding, what is comprising that existing system. And what I mean by that is on the HVAC side, are we talking about rooftop units? Are we talking about centralized
Hmm.
chiller plants, so on and so forth? On the lighting side, are we talking about the site's already been converted to LED? And then from there, we start making decisions on what's going to eke out the best solution. So what we're seeing the greatest conversion with and the greatest success would arguably be on the HVAC side, RTUs, especially on aging systems or aging facilities. Oftentimes, these have not been optimized with
Hmm.
VFDs, variable frequency drives. It's typically a relatively easy add to existing systems. It's going to ultimately prolong the life of that system, which is huge for clients because the capex expenditure to replace units is, as you can assume, quite high. So if we can eke out additional life while at the same time reducing the energy load, it's a tremendous win for clients. And so with that, we're often looking at the VFDs. We're looking at thermostats. It's something that is so often overlooked, but the reality is there's so many phenomenal technologies and solutions, but depending upon the application, to implement new thermostats that give remote accessibility, to give the ability to drive down demand costs during peak hour usage, to give centralized control of set points so that you don't have somebody going over and manually, increasing or decreasing the temperature. It allows you to get a far better sense of what your OPEX spend is going to be. And that's ultimately what drives all this. So it's driving down operating expenses so that we can ultimately create what I like to see as a snowball. And so rather than constantly asking for more cash to do upgrades, let's identify those solutions that are going to give us the quick wins and give immediate reduction to operating expenses. And then effectively take that money and reinvest it into the facility with, perhaps more costly upgrades that are going to net phenomenal results, but likely would not be something I would lead with. And then finally, the same thing can be said on the lighting side. Obviously, that's our core focus. Um, even in instances where clients have already done LED conversions, we've got a host of clients that we've actually gone through, and we may have done a LED upgrade 10 years ago. And due to the ongoing efficiency upgrades, there's actually a phenomenal payback story to go ahead and revisit that same site and upgrade to newer technologies of LED. And then, as I said earlier, the implementation of controls has been vastly overlooked throughout the entirety of renovation. And that's just low hanging fruit, and it can be, tacked on to any existing system as it is right now.
All right, well, let's talk upgrades then, right? And actually start to hammer in on some of these different avenues that a facility manager could take. Like you said, HVAC is a big one, right? That can, with the proper upgrade, can realize massive financial savings, right? And a diminishing of energy waste. But I'm curious, if when we compare all of the various avenues that a facility manager could take when they begin an upgrade process for their facilities with energy efficiency, as the target, right? Does it make sense to start with HVAC, right? Even if it is the biggest savings bucket, does it make sense to start a little slower or smaller or take smaller steps with other upgrades before going for a major HVAC upgrade? Or is this one of those situations where you recommend facility managers just rip the Band-Aid off, make the biggest upgrade possible early to, realize those savings immediately? I guess, what do you weigh more, the kind of operational weight of a huge upgrade or the potential savings of just going ahead and ripping that Band-Aid off?
Yeah, so to be honest, there's not a
Of
definitive
course,
carte
yeah.
blanche answer to that. And what I mean by that is simply, you know, candidly, that's one of the primary reasons I returned to FSG is just because of our overall approach to everything. And to pull the thread on that a little bit more, what I mean by that is working in lockstep with our clients to understand their overarching goals. And those goals can be driven by ESG initiatives, budget constraints, capital expenditure requests, so on and so forth, or even occupancy or tenant comfort. And so it's really a multi-pronged process to get to that point to where we can safely make a recommendation of what that prioritization should look like. And it's going to be different for every client. So in that, we typically take a very structured approach to first really engage with the client, understand what those various initiatives and motivators are. Following that, what we oftentimes like to do is start going through and identifying the site list, really taking into account various rebate and incentive applications, because depending on where the location's at, there may be significant incentives by the utility companies for HVAC or lighting or both. And then looking at also kWh usage, gas usage, and then if there's demand charges and penalties. And it's really not until we take in all that information, and what we're typically creating out of that is a short list or a prioritization. So the goal is to make life easier. There's already enough on the plates of these facility managers and owners. Now we're trying to take this on for them. We create this short list, this prioritization, and then we actually dispatch, walk the site, fully understand the site. And it's from that that we actually end up creating more or less a color-coded smorgasbord or a menu board, if you will, that allows them to very quickly ascertain, specific to that site, well aligned to their motivations, what is going to make the most sense. And at that point, it's looking at the systems itself, gas, water, electric, and building envelope, but then drilling down into the details and actually looking at the specific technologies or the specific solutions that we would recommend with fully attributed ROI, carbon offsets, ongoing maintenance reduction, and so forth. And so it paints a very clear picture. And candidly, the summation to all that is really my goal when engaging with any client is I'm looking to arm them with as much information as they possibly need to make a very, very astute decision on what's the best use of their capital at the end of the day.
Just to harken back to a previous episode of the podcast, let's touch on lighting here real quick. LED lighting is kind of a no-brainer. It's introduces more control into lighting, more flexibility, and of course a massive energy savings. Do you find that there are still even newer facilities that are a bit behind on some of their basic LED lighting upgrades? And how would you weigh something as kind of universally accepted as a positive energy efficient upgrade as LED lighting in the context of some of those energy audits and smorgasbord of options that you're presenting to your facility managers and decision makers?
I would say in a lot of instances, something could have always
Sure.
been done better. And that's really what we're looking to ascertain with that. So I candidly, I'm a self-proclaimed lighting
Love it.
nerd. I studied lighting design. That was my original passion, and that translated into energy efficiency projects. But what I inherently try to always bring to the table, and working alongside all of my colleagues, what we're always looking to do is find that right balance between quality lighting design and implementation and cost. And so what I mean by that is, even if you go into newer facilities, what I see so often, both new facilities and especially in existing facilities now have gone through retrofits where maybe it was decided to go low cost, or maybe it was a one for one. So often what's happening is that design inherently is not factoring in the appropriate foot candles, the appropriate illumination levels. Um, Really, we could go in such a rabbit hole with all this, but the other thing that I oftentimes see is, again, not taking into account all the variabilities of lighting. So somebody may get super laser focused on the idea that, I need 50 foot candles in this space. Well, that's fantastic. But foot candles to me mean absolutely nothing if you didn't also factor in
Mm.
uniformity. And that's something I see overlooked tremendously. And uniformity has a massive play in almost every vertical. As you can well assume, huge play in retail and so forth. But some of the less common places that people don't think about with this is both new construction and renovation retrofit of parking lots or parking garages. Those are probably two of the most important places to make sure that you're factoring in uniformity and not just simply saying, hey, I've got 5 foot candles here. Because again, it's all about creating a inviting, safe space. And inherently, us as humans, we're looking at contrast ratios. We may not know that's what we're looking at, but that's really what you're looking at. And so when you see really high highs and really low lows, you inherently don't want to go into that area. And so again, it's working in lockstep with clients to really identify all these different triggers that I candidly feel a lot of people tend to overlook. And so that ultimately leaves us with the ability to vastly improve. And then just the final tack onto this, and I know I keep harping back to this, but the reality is, even in new construction, especially if it's not in one of the municipalities or states that have adopted one of the newer IECC codes or Title 24 out in California, again, we see controls just wildly overlooked, and controls can be such a phenomenal addition to any of these spaces.
Thank you for teeing me up on that one, because I wanted to follow up on this wider ecosystem of automation, sensors, data, and all of that feeding a more confident controls ecosystem, right? Which doesn't necessarily hit on, having to gut your facility and build it back up from the inside out, but sometimes the best energy efficiency you can bring to your facility is adding a layer of analysis and data and better controls over your existing infrastructure, and then managing it accordingly. So how are you seeing a better controls ecosystem? Again, things like automation, sensors, data analytics. How are these changing the game for facility managers when trying to tackle and improve their energy efficiency metrics? And what are some of the tips and tricks that you've found work well for matching controls investments with actual need?
So, from a metric standpoint, it it ultimately comes first and foremost to really set expectations and get an understanding of how that's going to be utilized. Because what I have seen throughout the industry is I've seen far too many companies make the investment into wildly robust controls that give them the promise of indoor positioning, the ability to get real-time data monitoring, remote access, demand response reductions, all these phenomenal things. And don't get me wrong, every one of those things is fantastic in the right application. But what we find so often is they go unused. And so I really always like to understand how a client's going to utilize it, understand if it's going to be integrated into an existing energy management or building management system. But that's the beauty of controls. And so to just kind of pull that backwards just a little bit, as we go through these conversations, what I try to make explicitly clear to clients is due to the advent of wireless controls, uh, the ease of implementation is massive. And what I mean by that is we no longer really have to care about how the existing wiring is done. So while there may be a higher cost associated with the material, the labor is significantly less because now we're not having to run new low voltage wiring. We're not having to do anything really above the ceiling. It gives a lot of flexibility. It also inherently means that it future proofs them because as we go with this more granular approach, as the space changes in its use, it gives them the ability through simple apps to go through and actually reprogram how that space is done. And so, what I always harp on with my clients is really understanding that controls in the grand scheme of things to me is a Lego building block.
Yeah.
It's scalability. What I always tell them is buy what you need today, but don't buy something that doesn't give you the ability to grow as you need it to grow. And there's a lot of standalone controls, and in certain applications it makes great sense. If we're talking about a restroom, then yes, I don't need that restroom to communicate with the entire building. It can, but do we really get, is the juice worth the squeeze at that point? Likely not. But when we start talking about the other spaces throughout a building, if the client right now does not need remote access, if they don't need everything intercommunicating and getting these reports and having, interactive maps, I totally understand it. But that doesn't mean that they don't want it or need it
Right.
in 5 or 10 years. So what I always recommend is, let's start with a system that can be scaled up as we go by starting with the core components that are going to drive energy savings, give you that quickest ROI. And then as time progresses, if you need to add to it, typically it's as simple as adding a couple of bridges or some additional communication devices throughout the building, and then typically a gateway of some sort. Once you have that, you've got everything you need, and it gives just such wild flexibility.
All right, now let's take a second here, David, and offer more kind of from the ground perspectives and takes on things to avoid during this upgrade process, right? As facility managers get their audits made, right? As they assess their current needs and start to balance short-term investment versus future proofing for long-term needs as their facility grows and becomes more mature and capable. What do you see as some of the common mistakes that facility managers make during these energy efficiency motivated upgrades? What are the common missteps and why do they happen, right? And how can we recommend to our audience that they avoid them?
There's a couple of common items that I see. A relatively broad stroke item that I oftentimes see is a very siloed approach. And what I mean by that is, perhaps they get super laser focused on just a
Hmm.
lighting upgrade or maybe a specific space. As with everything in life, nothing happens in a silo. There's always complementary items that are happening and things that can trigger one another. So my recommendation to everybody is, if you're making the investment of whether it be time or money to do a audit and an assessment, my recommendation is always to take a very holistic approach. It's the best way to get a snapshot of the entirety of the site and fully understand that you are making the right decision to make your, or to put your investment where you're going to get the best ROI. So that would be number one. Number two, far more specific, but again, if we look at lighting, and this isn't to suggest that it's not the right call. It's certainly got its place, and it certainly is the leader in terms of ROI, or at least not always ROI per se, but it at least is definitely the path of least investment. And that would be doing LED lamp or tube replacements. Um, Again, it can be a phenomenal solution given the right application, but it comes with a tremendous amount of limitations. And so, what I oftentimes see is clients not looking at the total cost of ownership comparison between different methods. And so, if you get focused on just the top line dollar, then that's where we're inherently seeing a lot of people just simply go through and relamp. But in reality, if they were to step back and look at a total cost of ownership analysis, and especially with the implementation of controls, paired with the fact that most utilities far incentivize the integrated LED solutions, whether it be a new fixture or a retrofit. You factor in those incentives to help offload, paired with the additional savings that can be driven off of controls, which can be implemented with lamps, but it's far more difficult. And at that point, you'd be better off just making the investment in a integrated fixture. That, I find, is something that we're just seeing far, far too often. And again, the key takeaway there is it can absolutely make sense in the right application, but I would just always strongly recommend to people to at least go down the path of exploring multiple solutions and seeing what's going to net you the best long-term savings, the best long-term reduction in maintenance, and so forth.
Now, another important layer of this strategy for facility managers that I want to address with you is the layer of internal buy-in. When you are making any kind of facility investment and you are a facility manager, some kind of decision maker around facilities and building management, you are not just presenting your business case. You are often competing for funds and budget. You are having to weigh these investments and these projects against your company's controller or CFO, right? You are balancing various interests here. And it's important to help paint a holistic picture that goes beyond just, hey, I want new lighting. Okay, why? How's this going to impact tenant experience, customer experience, energy efficiency, right? All this stuff. Now, of course, energy efficiency is the focus of our conversation, so we'll hone in on the argumentation and buy-in strategies for that front. But what are some of your suggestions for maneuvering the things that hold organizations back from moving forward on some of these projects? And how do you recommend that facility leaders build a strong business case internally to help paint that picture for other stakeholders?
Yeah, so, ultimately it comes down to very poignant, very strategic conversations on the front end and getting alignment. Ultimately, the person that you're typically engaged with right at the onset that is taking the time to have these conversations, they've already got buy-in. And what we typically are looking to do is communicate to them and implore them to understand that we know the challenges you may face as you try to get, additional buy-in. Arm us with the information we need to help make that pitch easier for you. Help us understand what the key motivators are. Help us understand what some of the potential hurdles may be. Examples of that, there's a litany of them, but, some of the most common ones I see is, some customers are driven just by an internal rate of return, a specific ROI hurdle, a payback threshold, what have you. And all those things are very important. But at the end of the day, cash is king, and so a lot of times people are looking at what that total investment cost is. And so it's also understanding, if that's going to be a limitation, then let's really ascertain all the various ways that we can help offset that. And that can be through implementing various utility incentives. That can be through introducing 179D and helping offset, tax liabilities. It can also be as simple as, communicating the fact that, we've got the structure in place to offer, fully cash flow positive financing solutions to where none of this has any impact at all from a upfront cost standpoint. And we find that is a very attractive avenue with a lot of people. Obviously, the challenge there is, much like we see throughout the marketplace, costs are up and interest rates are up. So that's a bit less attractive than it was, a few years ago, but still a very viable vehicle that we see a lot of clients utilizing. But again, just to tie all that in a nice bow, it's really just communicating on the front end to understand what those inherent challenges may be, and expressing to them that our goal is to make life as simple for them as possible and eradicate those roadblocks.
Yeah, I mean, the more that you can build consensus early, especially around something as consequential as energy efficiency, which investors care about, a senior leadership cares about. These things impact, if this is a facility that sees customer traffic of any kind, right? That often has an impact on the relationship between brand and consumer even. So, these are investments that align with big picture goals from the jump. So like you said, it's really about, if there's something really granular, hey, we're going to upgrade all of our signage to LED, right? It has to be immediately contextualized around those bigger picture goals. You got to loop the right people in and be confident about the vision, right? Even if this seems like, maybe an investment that, might not have the biggest splash, help paint the picture for why this is an important long-term investment, why this lays the foundation for a larger positive benefit to energy efficiency goals, especially with investments around things like better controls, better data analysis on existing facilities infrastructure. So yeah, I love that piece of advice. I think it's generally applicable and something that our audience should take to heart for sure. Beyond that, as we look ahead a little bit and start to wrap up the conversation, like you said, we need to be guiding our audience here to make investments that do solve short-term goals, keep things practical always, but that aren't so short-term that they miss the forest for the trees, right? And that can still predict potential need down the line and can lay a foundation of more efficient facility management for years to come. What are some of the trends, some of the regulations maybe, or the market movers, the macro forces that you're keeping an eye on that you think facility managers and decision makers should be keeping their ear to concerning energy efficiency? And how should this guide some of the short-term investments that they make around energy efficiency upgrades?
The common goal, or the commonality that we've been seeing for years, is it's data-driven. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier with some of the controls and just some of these intercommunicating devices that are out there. They're all fantastic. And it's really, at the end of the day, you're going to get a tremendous amount of data, but it's what do you do with that data? And so what we're seeing a big trend in is various companies coming up as kind of these overarching aggregators or integrators, if you will, that help take all this information and data and actually start putting it into a bite-sized, easy to digest output that allows you to create actionable plans from. An example of this was I was recently on a call with a phenomenal partner of mine that was walking me through their process, and the inherent goal of it is to align extremely well with ESG or net zero goals. But the reality is ESG and net zero goals are really affectionately just predicated on the idea of reducing CapEx, OpEx, and driving efficiency measures, just with a far more specific goal in place. And what this solution does is it actually allows the upload, even if the client hasn't already made any kind of investment into a control system that can give real-time data, it's inconsequential. And used to, that wasn't the case. And what this new solution is doing is actually taking that information that every one of our clients already has. It's things as simple as utility bills, lease data, so on and so forth, square footage information, uploading it to this program, and it effectively goes through and allows us to start identifying the low-hanging fruit and identifying the sites, the locations, the geographical regions that are going to have the greatest impact. And it automatically takes into account all these different variables we've been talking about throughout the conversation here. So rather than just saying, hey, you've got a really high kWh rate, well, a high kWh rate doesn't mean anything if your usage isn't that significant. So this actually goes through and starts quantifying and taking into account all those different variables and really articulating a viable plan forward that's going to help reduce carbon emissions. It's going to help reduce demand charges and overall kWh spend, and inherently will also help drive down maintenance costs because it's arming the facilities with more information ahead of having to dispatch. And that's what we're seeing as well. That kind of leads into the idea of preventative and proactive maintenance. The conversation I have so often is, oftentimes CapEx budgets are put together once a year. Well, we don't all know what's going to happen. And if anybody knew what was going to happen, they'd probably be winning the lottery every day. So the reality is you're having to make decisions with very limited information. So if we can start deploying simple devices that give you real-time feedback and the ability to understand what's happening with your systems out there, all it's inherently doing is arming you with the information you need to better plan and not be in a reactive state, because that is by far the worst place you can be, especially in the service industry, because as everybody knows, whether you're a homeowner or a business owner, if you're having to do emergency dispatch, the cost is exponentially higher than if it was planned. And so the more we can do with that planned budget and start mitigating the need for emergency dispatches, we're just, again, arming clients with a better mousetrap at the end of the day.
Love to see it. All right, David, I think that about covers it for today's episode of the FSG Podcast. Before we wrap things up, obviously, FSG is a trusted partner in this space and one that helps make sense of a lot of these moving pieces for facility managers, right? Beyond being a solutions provider, y'all are also in your client's corner, right? Helping them make sense of how to frame the rhetorical narratives to create buy-in, how to right-size their solutions, all that good stuff. So, in an effort to point people in the right direction, I'm curious, where should organizations turn for a little more guidance and support? Let's say they're still trying to make sense of what their needs even are. Where should they start with an FSG, for example, to understand their situation and start to move the needle in the right direction around their energy efficiency upgrades?
Absolutely. Well, the simple path is, I'd welcome anybody to visit our website. It does a phenomenal job of walking through a number of the technologies, solutions, and ideas that we've spoken about. And also through there, for those that don't already have connection with us, there's a phenomenal portal on there that connects you directly with us, gives you the ability to tee up questions, tee up specific projects, and get experts immediately assigned to it that are going to start following this exact same process and mindset that we've been talking about. Shy of that, you can always go old school and just pick up the phone, call FSG. Our receptionist will always direct you to the right place, and happy to work with anybody.
Fantastic. David, thank you so much for your analysis today, all of your great insights. Really looking forward to more conversations too. There were a few layers of this we didn't get into, so let's leave this as a primer with our audience and leave them a little hungry for some more conversation here in the future. David, thanks again.
Pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for tuning into today's episode of the FSG Podcast. If you like what you heard and saw, and you want to tap into our previous discussions and analysis on some of the trends shaping facility decision-making and strategies, make sure that you're heading to our website, fsg.com, and subscribing to the podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. We'll be back with more conversations with the FSG team and beyond. We'll catch you on the next episode. I'm your host, Daniel Litwin, the voice of B2B. See you soon.